Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. Today we have a wonderful guest, and that is Professor William Gumede. William, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Yeah.
You were here some time ago, and we were just sort of started on this journey. I saw your article, which came out recently, the opinion piece you wrote, and that was around South Africa needing a consensus around South African values. Right. What are South Africa's values, and can we get consensus around them?
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy and very grateful that you invited me at the beginning of the year. Just wanted to wish your viewers a blessed 2024 and to yourself and your staff also. I think it's very important that as South Africans, we're a country in crisis. Almost all sectors of our society in crisis, breakdown of the rule of law, the sort of essential society that functions with rule of law. Economy is struggling because some of the world's highest unemployment, so poverty levels are very high, inequality, and then on the social side, the country appears to be tribalizing again. So the values of the country, sort of rainbow nation, inclusivity, for many people see that as a problem rather than as a strength. So we're in a real crisis, and then we're also in a crisis of values. I mean, you just see at the individual level, people claim their rights, but not their responsibilities and duties. People don't care for others. They do things without caring whether it harms others. Well, they're not worried about that, or the environment. Now, in such moments, when countries are in such a deep crisis, it's a moment to reflect, how do we create a new consensus? And what would be that new consensus? And I think we're at a moment where the country will have to look at a new nationwide or society-wide consensus of new values. What do we want to be as a society? Where do we want to go into the future? And what are the things that we actually value? And we have to have the conversation now. In 1994, after the end of formal apartheid, we constructed a consensus. At a time, so the consensus was creating a rainbow nation, or the idea of a diverse nation, a democracy, that we will deal with the racial injustices, and that we will build new institutions, and we will have social justice. And we'll have a law-based or rule-based society. Now, that essentially has been in crisis because of corruption, the lack of delivery, state failure, populism, toxic policies, and just our elected representatives has just not been caring of, and lack of accountability.
How does one even begin to embark on this? Because, in a country like South Africa, how would you even see a process start where we get to set consensus? How?
In our case, I think the only way we will be able to do that would be after an election now. Unfortunately, that is just, I think, the reality of it. We cannot, at this moment in time, do it in any other way, because in a democracy, one have an election, and an election then is a verdict on the party, on the governing party. So let's just say whatever new government that comes in, it may be or very likely be a coalition government, and then they will have to reflect on the direction of the country, and in that reflection there has to be an inclusivity, and there has to be a debate around a national consensus. And for me, the pillars of a national consensus would be, firstly, that we re-emphasize the Constitution as a core value of all South Africans, whatever your color, whatever your political party, because what we have now is our Constitution is being contested. We've got parallel constitutions in this country. We've got customary law in some of our rural areas where people I mean, our constitution doesn't reach them. I mean, I never heard of our constitutions, but what they are under the subject of customary law. If you're a woman, you cannot inherit, for example, assets, and or you can't have, you're unequal. So the constitution that says gender equality doesn't apply there. And then in some parts of the country, like whether it's the Cape Flats or or KwaMashu in KZN, where it's gang law. I mean, if you live in these townships, it's the gangs. I mean, it's their law, their governance, their constitution that governs people. And sometimes even in sectors on the roads, you've got your taxi, your minibus taxis, they actually have their own constitution. I mean, if you're an ordinary law-abiding driver, you have to give way. I mean, there's no rule. Yeah. Absolutely, I mean, you may be confined to the country rules, but for them, there are no rules. So, and then also the ANC as a governing party has its own rules. You remember that Jacob Zuma often said in the past when he was the president, it is the ANC before everything. It's our country's constitution. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa at some point also said the same thing. Similar stuff to say, well, if he has to choose, he will choose the ANC above everything. And we've just seen now, I mean, what is trending this week has been the ANC General Secretary, Fikile Mbalula, who admitted that the ANC lied to defend Jacob Zuma when he was the president. The ANC lied about Nkandla, that the swimming pool was a fire pool. This is a normal swimming pool, and they say it was a fire pool. And I mean, lying under oath to defend the ANC, the unity of the ANC, and to defend then President Jacob Zuma. So a new consensus really has to be the constitution above everything else. And then the second pillar has to be the rule of law. I mean, no country can prosper. We won't be able to deal with poverty, unemployment, inequality, and all of the issues that we struggle with unless there's a rule of law, unless everyone understand and follow the rules of and nobody's exempted. And what we've seen the last couple of years, we get politicians who are exempted from the rule of law. So it has to be part of the new consensus. And then for me, the third part of this new consensus has to be social justice element. We cannot run away from social justice. We've got to pass. So we will have to have the conversations to say, well, for the next 5 years, we will have to look after those who are vulnerable and who will never get a job and who never had a job. Many of them who never had a job since 1994, they've got into adulthood without a job. What we will have to do is give them something for the next 5 years on a regular basis. And also for our young people, even some people who are graduates who will never find jobs, or haven't had a job because of our low growth trajectory that we have. But what we need to do is make it a little bit more imaginative. So if we're going to give a basic income grant or whatever grant we want to give, is to link it into an ecosystem of education, of skills, of democratic education, and so on. So what do I mean by that? So if we give a grant, let's just say to a young person who's been unemployed, then there has to be responsibilities with that grant. For example, we could say, well, you can go on a technical training, but the kind of training that an emerging market economy needs, electrician, plumbing, that's, in an emerging market economy like us, that's the kind of skill set, welding, that's kind of skill sets for this, the level of our economy where we are. And then secondly, to bring in our democratic values, to say, you get this grant, but let's go on to the take you on a civic education sort of basic sort of thing that you understand gender equality, how you treat others, what are your responsibility as a citizen. So there's a responsibility. Or if other people, we could say, well, you volunteer for the grant sort of work, but a different kind of work. You could, for when you're a grant recipient, once a week, clean the streets. In your community, or be a guard with others around the school and see that children are safe, and so on. So, or if you're a parent, to make certain that your child is in school, so you get a grant at every term, you would report that child's in school, child's attending school, and so on. So more imagination and so on. And we could link it even with the private sector, because it is important. Stability is important to do business also. What we could do, for example, you get a grant, and the grant is linked to internship at companies, whether it's private companies or state companies, so very much more imaginative. So, but the important thing is that we have to have a part of that new consensus must be a social justice element of this. And then our diversity has to be core pillar of a new consensus. The world's most diverse society, but sadly, many South Africans think that our diversity is an obstacle to growth and to development. Actually, is the opposite. Diversity, if it's leveraged, actually, whether it's in an organization, in a community, or in a country, actually helps development, help growth. I mean, we've seen it in our rugby team, the Springbok team, when they won the World Cup, is actually the leveraging of diversity. Diversity across whether it's color, skill set, ideas, bring it all together, and so on. And that is actually at the heart of success of the Springbok team. I mean, I would even go as far and say, if you look at why Bafana, for example, the last couple of years has failed and hasn't been as successful as the rugby or as cricket, it is because of the lack of diversity. If you look at, during the periods when Bafana in the mid-90s and late 90s, when it was successful, it was a much more diverse team. So when I say diverse, it's not only in terms of, the color groups, but diversity of everyone around the world who's South African. They could be brought in, the skill sets, are brought into the structure of a team.
So now, Prof, it sounds like what you are alluding to or where this goes to is a colossal failure of government. Because one would imagine that, a government is formed, a political party gets a majority, as we have had in the past, and from that moment on, following the election, their job is to make South Africa the best place for all South Africans. And this has clearly failed, right? The natural place for consensus building, one would imagine, is Parliament, where you sit there and somebody from the opposition bench will say, our rail system is inappropriate or whatever, and then the Minister of Transport would answer to that, right? And you would have some kind of accountability. Now, once again, we are looking for almost a private sector solution to what is actually a public sector issue. And that is, it's the government's job to build consensus as much as it is their job to balance the books, isn't it?
No, absolutely. If you look at all societies after the Second World War, they build these consensuses after conflict or after the war. I mean, in Germany, after the war, they built a consensus. And it was a government-led consensus. I mean, their consensus was that, they won't go back to where they were. And secondly, they would build a thriving economy. An inclusive and thriving economy, that they would have prudent economic management, and that they would have a functioning and a professional public service and state. I mean, that was some of the elements, and even that they would have a private sector that also has quite a wide range of small business. I mean, it's been a core part of the German miracle after the Second World War. So that was their consensus. I mean, Japan, after the defeat in the Second World War, they built a new consensus where they actually decided that the old political parties and the leaders, they brought them into the war with discredited, and that they have to build, bring about new, fresh leaders, fresh ideas. And part of their consensus was a consensus of that they will never engage in a war, and that they wouldn't use nuclear as part for war purposes, and that they would have a society, they would build an economy that would be, in a couple of years from the Second World War onwards, be the top, the first or second biggest economy in the world. But they also built what we now call a social pact. The idea that business and government and civil society, trade unions, and so on, will work together to build the economy. And last year, this is quite an exciting thing from a South African point of view. I mean, they introduced the concept, and again, we now calling it after the fact, a company welfare. That's not what they in Japan called it, but that's what we're now calling it, where companies would look after their workers, and because they do that, the government will support the market economy, and will support the rise of the companies to become competitive global companies. And then maybe another example, I mean, more in Africa example, Mauritius, for example, they had independence, and it was an absolute disaster the first 5 years. Poor governance, state failure, ethnic divisions, and so on. And then what then happened was there was an opposition coalition that won, and they created a whole new consensus. And the consensus was the diversity of the society would become very important. So they would be inclusive as possible. They would build an export-based economy, so a manufacturing economy that exports. And so on, and they would be as inclusive as possible, and that coalition governments would become almost an identity of the society, the cooperation of coalition governments.
Now, you mentioned opposition coalitions. At this point, one has to also talk about your other role, right? And that is that you convened the talks that many of the opposition parties had at Empress Palace last year, which led to the establishment of the multi-party charter. Now that's an ongoing process. First, let's talk about the process itself. How was that? Were you happy with the way that the process worked? Because I think there's many people that are watching us that are saying, look, multi-party charter talks happened, and lots of photo opportunities and lots of backslapping. And then those very same parties went straight back to war in the local municipalities and metros. And obviously we sit here in Johannesburg with massive potholes outside and traffic lights that don't work. And were you happy with the way that the multi-party charter talks went?
I'm just going to ask you, your forgiveness. I just wanted to talk about two things, and then I'll come back to that. Just on building a social consensus,
yes.
Just two core elements from a South African point of view. I think it's a public service. If we could make the public service as part of a new consensus, the kind of a professional public service, which is inclusive and which is merit-based, and it's going to be key. Because because that is one of the reasons why we failed since 1994. We haven't been able to build a professional public service which is non-politicized, and it is not ethnicized, and it's not related to the party. So if you look at many of the developing countries after the Second World War, they had moved from poverty into as wealthy countries, because that's where we want to be. We want to be South Africa. It has to be a wealthy country, not a middle-income country. We want to be at the top. We have to be the ambition. It's the public service. It was the key, creating a merit-based public service, which is professional, which could run no matter who is in power, Singapore, South Korea, even the Japanese. And even in other societies, which is, like whether it's in Sweden or it's in Germany and so on, really, they so that's going to be important to have that as part of that. Everyone has to agree. In a new consensus that we get that sort of merit-based public service. And the last one really, which is key, is the culture of our society. I mean, one of the reasons why I think we failed since 1994 is we've corrupted the culture of society. What do I mean by the culture of society? It really is our standards of behavior, how we behave as individuals, as citizens, and how do we engage with others, with our neighbors, with other South Africans, and even how do we engage with people who are not from our ethnic group, from our color or our political affiliation. That's absolutely important. So if you look at the countries that build these social consensuses, whether it's the European ones or the developing countries, whether Singapore or Mauritius, a very big part of that was they changed the society's culture from the culture before, where there was really a set of basic values that everyone would adhere to. Certain ways of behavior, respectability, respecting others, as a big value of the society. And related to that is also from a political leadership point of view, is a culture of honesty. Because one can't build a wealthy nation without a culture of honesty. If leaders say one thing and do something totally different, what it does is not just a small thing. It immediately, you can't build an economy, you can't make policy decisions unless it's based on honesty. Governments can make honest mistakes, but as long as it's honest. So if it's lies driven, if lies becomes the main currency in a society, it becomes very, very difficult to build prosperous societies. And that's actually whether it's in Japan or in Singapore or in Germany or in Brazil in the 90s when they had their golden period under Lula. It is really the idea of honesty as a very big part of the country's culture.
Yeah, because that then allows for, a lot of speed, right? And that is that I can trust you. You've said you're going to do something. You said you're going to deliver it. It's quite laborious if we need a contract and we need a confirmation and we need this and that. If you say you're delivering next Tuesday and you deliver it next Tuesday, that kind of honesty does speed up business. There is absolutely no doubt about it.
No, absolutely. I mean, you see why many of the African countries have failed. It really is lack of honesty. Because honesty is really part of their rule base. It's a little bit different than rule of law, but a society has to be underpinned by honesty. So if you don't have that, you can't get contracts. There's no trust, and you can't build competitive societies, peaceful societies, stable societies, social cohesion. You can't build it unless there is, and honesty is a pillar of the society's culture.
And let's not forget that honesty keeps us alive, because that makes us go through a green traffic light because we think that the person's honest enough to stop at the red traffic light on the other side. Otherwise, the system starts breaking down, which goes back to what you mentioned earlier, where you're running two systems on the road, right? One where people are largely abiding by the rules of the road, and another sector of our road users that are playing to their own rule book.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, I mean, in some societies went really extreme to press their honesty, to kind of assert their honesty. In places like Japan and South Korea, or maybe as a better example is Singapore, spitting, for example. You would get a very strong sentence, and they even would reward people who see others doing wrong and report it. So not necessarily a crime, but just doing something seen as wrong.
Yes.
Which is not a crime, but is wrong. Yeah. And so on. In order for those societies, they had to go to that extreme to bring rule of law, but also honesty.
Now, Prof, I just want to go to consensus, and you've used quite a few examples of great success in the world of building consensus after the Second World War, which was quite, it was quite miraculous how many of these countries performed after the war, not only the ones that got defeated, but the ones that won as well. In many of those very examples, well, not necessarily the example of Japan, Germany, etc., but in many of the other countries where we've grown accustomed to consensus, there's no doubt that it's starting to fray, if not break down. We've had the case of Brexit, for example, which is, almost unthinkable that you would have half the country believing one thing and half the country believing something completely diametrically opposed. You saw that with the, in the last American general election where, the vote was split almost 50-50 and, half the American population was almost not prepared to accept the result. Is there a global crisis of consensus? And what has got us here that we've got so many instances in the world where social cohesion seems to be fraying at least, if not breaking down completely?
I think there's a global crisis, breakdown of consensus in many countries. It started off because of economic crisis that's become unmanageable, and so on. But, consensuses have to be renewed all the time, and many societies haven't done that. So in the UK, there's a breakdown of the consensus there, and there hasn't been a renewal, a new kind, finding a new consensus for our times, because our times have also changed.
Yeah.
Our world now is a different world than it was before. The world of technology now. Now we have companies like Google that's they're bigger than country economies. So we have to build a whole new consensus, for those sort of things. So that hasn't happened, and the same as the US, and sometimes some of our institutions are under such pressure, and the institutions have to deal with the whole new issues, and sometimes have not been built for the new issues, and then how do we rebuild, how do we find a consensus to reimagine and refocus those institutions. So that is very important. It hasn't happened. Even very stable countries, for example, that we've seen stable, like in Sweden, even they're in an absolute crisis also. And again, it is how does not only South Africa, but all of those countries relook at the consensus and reimagine the consensus. Of course, in developing countries like South Africa, it's even harder for us because we don't have the strength of the institutions of the countries like a Germany that has built a long consensus, and built very strong institutions. So it's easier for them to reimagine because they've got very strong and deep-rooted institutions that I've built based on a past consensus. Our one has been very brittle since 1994. So it's harder, but I think also more exciting and we've got more opportunity. So we shouldn't look at things as harder, but we just have to be more imaginative and more innovative and use all of our ideas and our diversity much more in the country to deal with our issues.
Yeah, one could argue that it must be considerably easier to build consensus when you have one or two TV channels, right? One or two newspapers, and everybody believed that. Now we've got the internet, and people watching us today will have a completely different view of the country and its issues compared to somebody who's in the cubicle next door to you at work, or perhaps in the bedroom next door to you at home. Yeah. Which brings us to the point of South Africa, which is obviously in our diversity. We're heading towards a crucial time. We've got a general election where for the first time we're going to feel some more uncertainty, because whichever way one looks at it, the deck chairs are starting to shift on this little boat, that the good old ship South Africa, and that is that probably for the first time in our modern history, the ANC is not guaranteed a majority, and that's already causing behavioral change.
Yeah, no.
Now, if one talks about consensus, how do you think South Africans are positioned to handle that kind of, in some case, almost radical change for many South Africans?
No, absolutely. The last 30 years, our world has been dominated by the ANC. Our society has been dominated by the ANC and ANC policy and so on. And because the ANC is a liberation movement, the ANC's idea of governance has been to take every part of society, the commanding heights of society. That's been the ANC's ideology, whether it is sports to get their people in there, or whether it is business, and so on. So the ANC has almost become a party state, where the party and the state becomes the same, and then it also dominates the economy. Even if you're a private company, if you engage with the state, you have to follow the rules of the party state.
Boy, do I know that. Yeah.
And because the ANC itself is now in an absolute crisis, I mean, the ANC is actually has its own struggle of consensus. So the consensus that the ANC built, because it's not only that societies have a consensus, organizations have a consensus, businesses have a consensus. And often organizations fail and parties fail because they can't renew the consensus of what is the business now in our times. That's why many companies fail. They're unable to refresh, to reposition for changes that has happened. So the ANC is a political party that's actually failed to do that. So its ideology is still in the 1980s and 1970s in a world now of the world of technology. So they still sort of state-based, they still think of job creation by building these sort of big industrial projects and so on, whereas the jobs are now being created in technology. And so you can already see this is two diametrically different type of things. And in a party state, the sad thing about party state is if there's a crisis in the party, then there's a crisis in the state, and then there's a crisis in society. So the ANC's crisis then becomes a country's crisis. And that's the difference between when we have a normalized democracy, a governing party in a normalized democracy. If that governing party has a problem, it's the governing party's problem. It's not a state's problem. It's not a society's problem. And that is why when you have liberation movements that is like the ANC that governs in a party state, when they lose their own consensus or it becomes poison or becomes toxic or becomes outdated, it's not just a destruction of the party, but it becomes a destruction of the state. And it also undermines a society. So we are right there where we are now. And now that brings me to, me as independent chairman of building, putting together a coalition, alternative coalition.
Yeah, I wanted to just set the scene for people, just so that they can understand, because another part of, where you hit the headlines last year was you didn't convene it, but you were certainly trying to keep all these parties together as they were forming what is today the multi-party charter. Now, that happened last August, if I'm not mistaken, and parties walked out of that and seemed to have reached some kind of charter, as the name suggests, which to South Africans sort of feels like a coalition, but it's not yet. Let's start there. Were you happy with the way that the talks went?
Yeah. Absolutely. The first thing that I have just to say is, the ends of the liberation consensus, so I would call the ANC's governing periods between 1994 and now as a liberation consensus. So we're now coming to the end of that. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Many ANC members, many ANC supporters, they may have problems with the ANC, with corruption and mismanagement and lack of direction, are worried about what would be a post-liberation consensus look like. It's almost a bit like the kind of trauma bond. So you are with an organization or you're with a partner that's very harmful to you, but you've been with a partner for a very long time, but you're fearful of breaking, you're fearful of the future. It's almost where, the toxic, the abusive partner is of the devil, a better devil, afraid of the new world outside that. So that's where we are as a society, or for many, obviously not for all, in a country. Now, I think the post-liberation consensus will be one of a coalition consensus. It is very likely that we would have, after the coming elections, a coalition government. What is a coalition government with the ANC? In a coalition, let's say, with EFF or with MK, Zuma's MK, or whether it's going to be the multi-party charter in a coalition. I think that's our new consensus. So we're going to have a coalition consensus. A lot of people are very fearful about coalitions because, we've seen some of the spectacular failures, particularly in Johannesburg, of coalitions. We've seen it in Nelson Mandela Bay, coalitions that hasn't worked out. But firstly, I have to say, I did a study with my team of supporters, the Wits School of Governance, that if you look at some of the coalitions at the local government level, actually the large majority of the coalitions are actually working perfectly. And actually, the delivery has been better than, let's call it, one dominant party governance at a local level. So we've seen a big failures, obviously in Johannesburg and then in Swane and Nelson Mandela Bay. That kind of obscure the success of it, sort of the smaller councils that's been working. Now, the thing about coalition as a governance form or as a consensus form, as a new consensus, coalitions actually are more appropriate for diverse societies. And secondly, more appropriate for societies to come from conflict. So I'll give you examples from around the world. Let me start with developing countries. Brazil, since the end of military rule in the late 1950s, can you imagine they have had success for decades as being coalitions. The Lula da Silva Workers' Party coalition of the early 90s had like 9-10 parties in their coalition across the ideologies. Okay, the Workers' Party on the left, and then they had very, very conservative parties. So, and they've actually built, what we're now looking back during the period of the 90s under the Lula government in Brazil is sort of a golden era of Brazil, high growth. Brazil's companies around the world became very competitive. The agriculture became competitive. They built a big aero industry sector as a developing country that has actually been under coalitions. And they had racial peace for the first time, like really strong. And because they also are diverse societies as us. And Mauritius, more closer to us, the coalitions. Mauritius, South Africans may not know, as this is diverse as South Africa, and they have similar type of issues. They may be a smaller country, but similar issues. Their coalition consensus that I've had consistently since the 1970s has delivered in Africa, the strongest, the most consistent growth rate, most consistent peace and development and export economy. So a coalition consensus, and that's a period we're very likely to go into after this election, is not to be feared. And that's one of the reasons why when I got a call from the coalition leaders to chair the effort, because they had struggled to put a coalition together because many of these parties have been fighting each other in elections or in parliaments and so on. And now to get them together to actually agree to form a coalition wasn't easy among themselves. So they looked outwards and said, well, let's find an independent person who's not part of any of the parties to try to get that together. Now, it's pretty historic because it's the first time in South Africa's modern history where we have a pre-election coalition. Now, normally our coalitions kind of put together after an election when there's not a majority. And that's normally how people look at coalitions. Around the world, there has been successful pre-electoral coalitions are often successful when you have a very dominant party in power and you need to get that party out. And when one single party cannot win against a dominant party, and I think this is where we are as a country. I don't think this year's election there will be one individual on a mass movement that will rise to power. Like, let's just say, Mary Robinson when she was in Ireland, when she rose to power on a mass base, or Macron when he went, or the current Chile leader on sort of mass support. So I don't think this is the moment in South Africa. Maybe another election, but not this election. So this is an election where it's going to be a coalition election. So I think it was for the coalitions, for the main opposition parties to come to me and ask to navigate them through that process was actually a maturity of like, understanding that as individual parties, they won't be able to dislodge the ANC. So it would be better to work together and create almost orderly a coalition consensus post the ANC's liberation consensus. You know, let's build it with our eyes open and based on policies. And so a big part, and which is exciting and totally new for South Africa, is actually as a coalition partners. I mean, actually have a set of policies, including the constitution, social justice, that are all at now, you know, they bought into, they kind of wrangle over, fought over, and finally compromise on a set of policy principles. And then they, you know, the last couple of months, they've changed their own kind of party policies to adhere to the sort of the bigger overall policy agenda of the coalition. I mean, that's never ever happened in the modern history of South Africa. I mean, they've got set of principles. So when they go to government, say like they win the elections, you know, they would have principles for how to govern set out very clearly. Dispute resolution mechanisms very, very clearly. You know, when you govern, there are disputes. Even in our personal lives, we have disputes. But as long as you know how you're going to deal with the disputes beforehand, and so on, and even in terms of, you know, agreements on how a cabinet would look like. I mean, those are very new, and obviously, you know, many people. I think there is a cautiousness among many South Africans about coalitions because of some of the failures of the coalition. But I think this is something so different. And the success stories of these sort of pre-electoral coalitions in developing countries has been astonishing. If just look at the best performing African economy since the Second World War. I mean, 54, 55 African countries, and only 5 of them has actually done well. I mean, that is a terrifying statistic. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying statistic, particularly for many South Africans who want to go for some solutions, African country type of solutions, if like 50 of 54 African countries have failed. I mean, why would you go there? But those countries have actually been successful, actually being on this sort of the number one has been a pre-electoral coalition type of consensus. As Mauritius, and even if you look at Cape Verde, it's a little slightly different. But they had, after the end of their liberation consensus, when the PAGC, which is a bit like the ANC, when they lost power, and they actually created a consensus which involved, at that time, or, you know, the liberation movement and the opposition. So they created something totally different, a consensus that involved the old Liberation Party and a new opposition party. And I mean, they have been so successful. I mean, if you look at their constitution as good as the South African constitution, I mean, if you look at the growth that came when they created that consensus coalition consensus, I mean, it was spectacular compared to the years before. If you look at the stability, the social inclusion, the peace in the country.
So now, you had the talks, but the work isn't done, is it?
No, so. I mean, I have an approach with these sort of things, and you know, everyone different. My approach was we get coalitions together. You get the deal, fundamental deal. That's obviously the hard works and weeks. So the convention was just one part. I mean, we got preceding, you know, weeks and weeks of negotiation to bring it down to the core issues. Yeah. So the convention was really focused on the core issues. At that, you know, so many of the other issues were negotiations prior to that. Now, then the next phase, normally after when you build back together like that an agreement, is to build trust among leaders. Because if you think about it, yeah, you get your deal, but as parties have been fighting for many, many years, you know, different policies for many, many years. At a local level, stuff is still going on, you know, tensions and so on. And so on. So there has to be then approach, like two processes at least, core processes. Is the one is that deal at a national level will then go down, each individual party takes it down to their kind of constituent structures, and then they kind of, have resolutions, they debate it, they adopt it, so it becomes part of the party's fundamentals. So that's a bit of a process. And then the second one is the process of actually now getting to know each other.
So from here on, the charter's in place, the parties go back, they all campaign individually. Once the numbers are in, the charter kicks into effect, and you know exactly what to do thereafter. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the parties will, and so the agreement is the parties will campaign individually with a bit of obviously now amended manifestos, so manifestos that incorporate now the broader principles, but still their own uniqueness. As parties, and that's a deal that many people may not know is a deal that goes until the 2029, until the next election. Okay. So it will go to the next local government election also until 2029, because it could be, for example, let's just say the coalition now brings the ANC down to under 50%, and that would be success. For me, as an individual, I believe that would be success. But then the ANC goes into a coalition, let's say with the EFF or with Zuma's MK, and still governs at a national level. That will mean that a coalition will actually have won a couple of provinces, and then they could build centers of excellence in the provinces. Let's just say KwaZulu-Natal, or let's say Gauteng. They would then have a period as a coalition to govern together and build, alternative kind of center provincial excellence, and so on. And then based on that, they could then fully win. I mean, if they can convince society that in the provinces that are in control, their provinces looks differently from the provinces that our ANC coalition would be in charge of. And, then in the run up to 2029 elections, they could then win a decisive victory.
And just to sort of just a little thought here, who gets to set who is in the coalition? I mean, like, what would happen if you got a call from Jacob Zuma saying MK wants to join the multi-party charter? Is there a criteria that he would need to satisfy, or is it any registered political party that could come along?
That was actually quite a big part of, because that was one of the potential stumbling blocks. A very, very big part. It was a really robust discussion in terms of how to bring in, who would qualify to join. They've now, so part of the agreement was quite clear kind of set of principles, what it would be, and then for parties to be interviewed. Let's just say the Constitution. Do you, as a party, adhere at all times to the South African Constitution? Honesty and corruption, is that? So there's a clear criteria. So obviously a lot of parties are not going to make it on that criteria. And just economic management, what kind of economy? Market-based economy, or what kind of economy? You're going to have a communist economy or populist economy? That you're not going to fit into the coalition's criteria.
And do you have the mechanism to kick somebody out if they break those principles?
Absolutely. So the idea is now that they've all signed up, and you've seen what I try to do. And the end of the convention, I try to make it symbolic, a sort of a public sign on that's in front of the media that we had. I got every leader to sign in front of the media to sign a pledge. Based on the principles. So two things would happen. Let's just say one of the parties contravene, for example, some of the principles, that would be a way of kicking them out. Obviously, the difficulty with these type of agreements is not fully legal, and these are also political parties, politicians.
Yeah, you can't take them to jail, right?
And so on. But really, that is really the integrity of leaders, because, the whole idea really of this coalition is also to try to establish a new culture of politics. To get an agreement which is based on a set of values, but it's also a set of behaviors which would be hopefully morally higher, and or rather, maybe a better way, with integrity, so that they've signed an agreement. Let's say the DA have signed on that after the elections, when the ANC needs a partner, that they're not going to join up with the ANC because that would be against the sort of integrity pledge that is part of this. Or it could be the same with the IFP, because ANC may be trying to get the IFP in KwaZulu-Natal because it may not want the EFF and it may not want MK and then they want to go to the IFP. And they would obviously sweeten, they very likely would then sweeten the deal and, patronage and so on. But from an integrity point of view and the basis and the pillars of this agreement for the IFP then in such a situation to go and join the ANC in a provincial coalition when they sign this sort of thing, this deal, which is based on integrity and so on, will really... it would not look good for them, yes. I think, in the eyes of the public and also in the eyes of their own constituency, their own voter base, but also internally, most probably they'll have some internal wranglings.
Sure. Well, Professor William Gumede, thank you so much for joining us today and explaining a little bit more about the multi-party charter and also how the importance of consensus. I think that everybody's watching us today, the consensus is that this is very important. And I think that South Africa needs to get together and decide what it wants to be, and we look forward to it. We'll have you back when we can talk a little bit more about the politics of it all. But Professor William Gumede, thank you so much for joining us today. To everybody that watched us, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for sharing your time with the State of the Nation, and we'll see you again the next time. Thank you.